Thank you very much, everybody. I want to have a show of hands. How many people just speak English? Please raise your hand. Okay, and how many people understand both languages? Las dos. Muy bien. ¿Quién habla solamente español? Okay, muy bien. Entonces, I'll do this in English. You know, it's easier for me in Spanish, but I'll do this in English. Okay, I don't know if this is my 8th presentation. You know, it's been several years that I have the honor of presenting during the Lea Month. And it's always a challenge. For the first years, my only theme was bullfighting. And one presentation I did about Benito Juárez, about the painting of Benito Juárez that Lea did. And today I'm going to have a new theme, which is very exciting. Actually, I started investigating this because we were going to do a trip based on the places that I'm going to talk about in Mexico. And we will still do that trip. You know, I think that you're going to be more interested once that you see the presentation. But now this is based on the work, you know, the writing, the book of Tom Lee called The Hands of Cantu. And The Hands of Cantu is it's a novel where it's a historic novel, where you understand the process that had to happen in order for horses to come to the New Mexico and to this region. And it's very interesting to understand. You know, I started back in 2009 getting interested in history because, as Holly said, I wanted to get in love with my region again. You know, we had a terrible time of violence at that time, and we had to find the details to love, you know, again. And one way you can get in love with things again is by knowing them deeper. And in history, that's something that you do through history. And next week, believe it or not, for me, Monday, I'm going to give my last homework to graduate in my Master's of History. So I'm finishing my Master's. So now officially I'm going to be a historian with a Master's degree in history. And I've learned a lot. You know, actually I've done a lot of investigation, but now I have the theory behind it, and that's great. One of the things that I learned in this Master's, you know, classes that I took is that I'm going to talk about history in the 19th century. And in the middle of the 19th century, we have the positivism. You know, everything had to be based in science. And even history became a positive history. Everything had to be scientific. Everybody was very worried about the facts and to be able to prove the fact as history. But one of the big problems that we have with history is that history talks about the past. In the past, it's impossible to redo again. You know, you can not do the past. So what happens when you investigate history is only with science, with scientific facts, is that you just get the facts that you find and you can prove that really happened. And then you have all these big gaps. So if you only talk about history based on facts, it's a very dry history. There's no heart. There's no feeling. So suddenly at the end of the 19th century, we had the Romantic movement. You know, people were fed up with science. They wanted love. We had Verdi, and we had, you know, all these big operas like, you know, La Bohème of Puccini, and everything was romantic and very detailed and very passionate. And that also influenced history. A lot of people, a lot of historians started saying, you know, facts is not enough. I think that we can also learn history if we start doing a description of and using other sciences, like anthropology, like music, like art, photographs. You know, we had photographs at the end of the 19th century. What that meant is that if you analyze, for example, the paintings of Michelangelo, and you see the surroundings and the context, you start learning facts about the history of the time. So it is very important, also for history, it was very important for history to add these new tools for the narration of history. And then in the 20th century, there was a school back in the 1930s, 1940s, at the time of Tom Lee's, started working more heavily, especially in the 1940s. In history, that was called the microhistorians. And the microhistorians are those that no longer see the big events, the big heroes, the big wars. Microhistorians are the ones that start analyzing everyday life to understand history. And let me give you an example, because this is a beautiful drawing that Tom Lee has in the book, Hands of Cantu. And you see the plains. Now, this type of plains, you can only find them in Texas or in Chihuahua, like that, with this type of grass. And if you go from here to Granada, you're going to see something very like this. And then after you go to Sueco, between Sueco and Chihuahua, you're going to see another plain like that, exactly like that. And then you're going to see the beautiful sky, and the clouds, and the loneliness. And even though it's a thin painting, you can see the space, and you can feel the space. And you can see bravery, because he's completely alone, and maybe in a space filled with Apaches. And then he has a long spade, you see the long spade. And then you have all the attire of a warrior and the horse. Without that information, you can start imagining a context. And then you can start narrating history of the time. So this is what a microhistorian does. So for me, it was very interesting to see that Tom Lee is a microhistorian. And he's going to start, analyzing big events, like the big events. This is Cortez. This is a drawing of Tom Lee of Cortez. He has some writing there. So in 1519, Cortez arrived in the present-day Veracruz, Mexico, where he founded the first Spanish settlement and named it Villarrica de la Veracruz. The dominant population of the region, not of Veracruz, but in Mexico at the time, was the Aztec, the Nahuatl. And they ruled under the powerful Moctezuma. And actually Moctezuma was a very demanding, let me put it that way, chief, because he demanded a lot of human sacrifices. And people were really mad with Moctezuma. They were fed up with Moctezuma. And that's one of the reasons why Cortez is going to have an easy time finding allies to go and conquer Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City. When Cortez first landed, the Aztecs thought that he was one of their gods. He was Quetzalcoatl, who was characterized by the light skin, red hair, and light eyes. And Cortez resembled those characteristics. It was a mystical belief of the Aztecs that Hernán Cortez was Quetzalcoatl and were enlightened by him to the point of lavishing adoration. In the Aztecs mythology, Quetzalcoatl was a manifestation of the sun god Tezcatlipoca and was represented by a serpent with feathers, with a plumed serpent. On August 13, this past August 13, it marked the 500th anniversary of the last battle between Cuauhtémoc, who succeeded Moctezuma, one of the Mexican Tlatoanis, and Hernán Cortés, one of the Spanish conquerors. This event will be known as the fall of Tenochtitlan and the birth of the Mestizo people. This is when less than 800 men were able to defeat over 250,000 Aztecs. How is that possible? Well, because they were accompanied by another 200,000 Tlaxcaltecas that accompanied Cortés, because the Tlaxcaltecas were fed up because they were the ones putting the human sacrifices. All the daughters and the children and the firstborn were being offered to the king of the Aztecs. So they were really fed up. So they joined Cortés because he promised one thing. If you let me lead, I will not ask for human sacrifices. That was the main, bargaining tool that he had. So the Aztecs accepted. And there's another funny thing. After the Tlaxcalteca chief was so thankful after they won the battle, he has assigned, he had a very big daughter, huge daughter. And it was given to Cortés as a present, and Cortés didn't know what to do because what am I going to do with this? Big lady. Well, he had to accept, and he carried the big lady everywhere. So that's not the next the next lady that I'm going to talk about. Well, the battle between the Mexican army and the Spanish. Well, this is Mexica army. This is the Aztecs. And so the Spanish soldiers lasted about 3 years. It all started when, he arrived in 1519, took the coast, as I said. And then he went after Tenochtitlan. In the history of the so-called conquest, there was a fundamental character so that Cortés could settle the Mexican territory. It's about the Malitzi, better known as the Malinche, or Marina, as the Spaniards called her, who helped the Spaniards to communicate with indigenous people in order to defeat the Mexican Empire. She was a translator. Sometimes in Mexico cultures, when somebody loves some, things that aren't from the outside, it's called the Malinchista, remembering Malinche. But actually, it's not fair for her. She was only a translator, and actually, she married Cortés, and. Well, Cortés is the one that first brings horses. At the beginning, around 14 horses. 14, okay? That's it. And they're the ones that survive and arrive into Mexico. So there wasn't a lot of horses, but the Aztecs didn't know the horses. And it was very impacting for them, to see the horse for the first time. And from Veracruz, when he got to Mexico City, the house of Cortés was built next to the cathedral. It no longer exists, but it exists right there in that corner. If you're in front of the cathedral, on your left side, on that corner, you will see that building. That building is where the Cortés house was first established. That was destroyed. That building was destroyed, and then this one was built later. But that's a very important place because that's the place in Mexico that first started the reproduction of horses in Mexico, and right at that corner. Okay, so in the history of horses in Mexico, that corner is important. That started the reproduction of horses in that corner. Okay, the natives who had been very fierce, they also generated great fear of the Spaniards, so they did everything to prevent them from taking up arms against them. One of those actions, the Spaniards were afraid of Indians. And one of the actions that they did is that they forbidden Indians to ride horses. They were afraid. And the order that was signed by Cortés was right there in that house. He prohibited all Indians, even Tlaxcaltecas at the beginning, to ride horses. And, well, they started also, little by little, lending horses to the native, but they had a big risk that if they ran, and they learned how to ride it, it was, that's why they were punished by death, if they seized some of the animals. But the indigenous people, little by little, they were in charge of taking care of the horses. So they started learning how to deal with horses. And suddenly, especially the Tlaxcaltecas were the first ones to learn how to ride. Now, all of this is described in Tom Lee's book, and it's interesting because it's a novel, but when you start taking the facts out of the book, out of the hands of Cantu, and you go and check them, they're truly, historical. So it's interesting how, he in his novels, he's not inventing, he's imagining, he's doing narration, but it's this micro-historian that is more romantic, that is not so much worried about the facts, but he's worried about the story and about the context and about describing the context. Okay, in 1535, Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza, he finally approved for the Indians to start riding the horses. And then it was so big that Cortés built another house in Coyoacán. And this is the house of Cortés in Coyoacán. And he, built this for the Malinche to have a walk, and has a beautiful park in front and a beautiful church and a great bakery right in the corner, in the middle of the, whenever you go to Coyoacán, don't miss the bakery. It's also on the left side of the church. Okay, so that's where he had, a guy called Diego de Ibarra, Don Diego de Ibarra, that is also one of the characters in the book. But, I'm going to talk more about Don Diego de Ibarra, but first I'm going to sing a song that is called El Jinete. And this is not of the time, but they talk about horses. This is one song, written by José Alfredo Jiménez, which talk about that guy that is missing his girlfriend, riding at night in the horse, and he's very sad because she's no longer with him. So I'll be singing El Jinete, and please give a, applause to Ezequiel Mesa, I'm sorry, who is our pianist tonight, and it's a wonderful accompaniment.
Que su vida y la perdió para siempre, por eso lleva una herida, por eso busca la muerte.
This is the first time we do this. We didn't have a chance to practice and rehearse. I have not sung in a year and a half. Okay. So, maybe some people, you're doing this, with no rehearsal, but it's hard. The pandemic was very hard for artists. We had to go and hide, and we have to, return to our normal pace. Okay, Diego de Ibarra was born the year of 1520 in Guipuzcoa, the town of Ibar, in Spain, in the Basque Country, in the Kingdom of Castile. Currently, Spain, Diego de Ibarra, Cristóbal de Oñate, Baltasar Treviño de Bañuelos, and Juan de Tolosa discovered the mines in Zacatecas. On September 8, 1546, Diego de Ibarra founded Zacatecas, of which he was the mayor for a long time. Okay, so Don Diego de Ibarra, that used to work in the Coyoacán house of the Malinche, was brought down to Zacatecas. Actually, he came and he discovered the mines together with the other two guys there, and he became a very rich man. Look at this name. Oops. Look at this name, Cristóbal de Oñate. Cristóbal de Oñate is going to be the father of Don Juan de Oñate, who is the guy that is going to come and, start the foundation of New Mexico and us. Okay? So, Don Diego de Ibarra came down to Zacatecas, and that's beautiful Zacatecas. That's the Cerro de la Bufa, right there in the top, right there. That's where the entrance to the mine is, and all of this is mined. And it's a beautiful colonial city. If you've never been to Zacatecas, I think that this is one of the most beautiful colonial cities in Mexico, and they have redone the whole, recovered the whole city, and it's just a beautiful place to visit. Well, the guy that helped Don Diego de Ibarra, both in the house of Coyoacán, and later he's going to be brought to Zacatecas to do all the horse racing, is Don Evaristo Rodrigo Cantú, known in the province of New Spain as Don Vito Cantú. And this is one of the main characters of the Tom Lee's book. And he was born in Andalusia. And he brought 2 Bavarian stallions and 5 mares. Okay? So remember, after the 14 horses, original horses, he brought this with the sole purpose of racing horses. Okay? And in these actions, Don Rodrigo Cantú, who was an employee of Diego de Ibarra, he's going to start what is now known as the Ibarra horses that still exist. And the Ibarra horses are, the origin, they told back to the work of Evaristo Rodrigo Cantú, which did exist. Okay, so this is also a historical character in the book of Tom Lee. Evaristo, before he came to Zacatecas, in between, he was brought down to Toluca, going north. And it was here where Don Vito Cantú was giving all the requisites to found and develop the Ibarra stud, using as his foundation the stallions and the 5 mares that he brought from close to Ronda, and they survived. Those animals were the ones that survived the voyage. And so he started the work of creation of the Ibarra horse, the breed of Ibarra, in Toluca. Later in the book, he mentions that Toribio de Ibarra was actually an Indian that had no last name. So Don Diego de Ibarra gave him his own last name. That's why he was known Toribio de Ibarra, but his only name was Toribio. And he was sent to Vito, Don Vito, to be the help, to start racing horses. And in the book, Tom Lee talks about the Hospital de Jesus, which is the oldest hospital still working in the continent, founded by Cortés, very close across, to the side of the cathedral. So this is the oldest, hospital that still is there working. It's still, you can still go in and you can see the image of Cortés. This is the bust of Cortés right at the entrance in the central garden of the hospital. And it's wonderful to, once you have read the book, and then you walk right there in downtown square in Mexico City, and then you go to the corner when they started the horses, and then you go to the Hospital de Jesus where Toribio Ibarra was born, and then you go to Coyoacán. You know, you can start imagining, you know, Cortés with all the horses going around, you know, and Toribio and Don Vito, you know, starting to move the horses around in the region prior to coming to Zacatecas. Well, Don Vito and Toribio are the ones that are going to race. It says that in Zacatecas they have close to 65,000 horses. So they had a lot of horses. The Ibarra horse, you know, Don Luis de Velasco y Ruiz de Alarcón, you know, it's also mentioned in the book. He was the first to recognize the quality of the Ibarra horse, and this is also a historical fact. Okay, I'm going to sing Rayito de Luna. Rayito de Luna is somebody that is walking at night, like at that first image that is the soldier is alone in the dehesa in the middle of the, you know, pastizales. The only thing he sees is the light of the moon, and you know the light of the moon reminds him of his girlfriend. Rayito de Luna.
Entre la selva dormida, así la luz de tus ojos ha iluminado mi pobre vida.
Okay. Walking in the middle of the pastizal, and there's only the light of the moon. Here we have Tom Lee in one of his great characters. You know, that they started horse breeding in sufficient numbers to establish a self-sustaining population. And that developed into what today is the southwestern United States, starting in 1598 when Juan de Oñate founded Santa Fe, Nuevo Mexico. From 75 horses, you know, so the work of Diego de Ibarra, Don Vito, you know, Toribio, done in downtown Mexico City, Coyoacán, Zacatecas, you know, 65,000 horses. So they started distributing horses, and a lot of those horses started being robbed by the Indians, and they started losing control. So we're going to start having a wild population of all of those animals that actually some of them end up living by themselves. And the same thing happened when Don Juan de Oñate started coming down, and he first brought 75 horses, in his initial, coming, and he expanded that herd to 800, and from there, the horse population immediately increased. We see this beautiful drawing of Tumbly, where we see the, Apache Indian from the region watching, an Spaniard handling a horse. And can you just imagine watching them, all of the things? They were very smart and very curious. So the first thing they did is, let me try to steal some of those because they can help us also, And later, one of the things that is going to happen is that the Irish, started asking the Indians to come and steal horses. And there was an illegal trade of horses with Irish and the Apache Indians. And all of that also helped for the horse to go farther north. Santa Fe became a major trading center in the 1600s. Although Spanish laws prohibited Native Americans from riding horses, the Spanish used Native people as servants, and as I told you before, and some were asked to take care of the livestock, and then so they learned how to handle. And then one of the, they started, training them also for food and for other goods. So they suddenly lost control of the horse population. In the Pueblo Revolt, in the 1680s, they killed a lot of the Spaniards, but a lot of the horses were left there. So a lot of those horses ended up becoming a wild population. From the Pueblo, they started trading. The Pueblo Indians started trading to the Apache, to the Navajo, to the Utes. And the Comanche acquired horses and provided them to the Shoshone. And then the Eastern Shoshone and Southern Utes became traders who distributed horses and horse culture from New Mexico to the northern plains. West of the Continental Drive, horses distribution moved north quite rapidly along with the western slopes of the Rocky Mountains, skirting desert regions such as the Great Basin and the western Colorado Plateau. Horses reached what today is southern Idaho by the 1690s. The northern Shoshone people in the Snake River Valley had horses in the 1700s, and by the 1730s they reached the Columbia Basin and were east of the Continental Divide in the northern Great Plains. The Blackfeet people of Alberta had horses by 1750, and the Nez Perce people in particular became master horses breeders and developed one of the first distinctly American breeds, the Appaloosa. And then most other tribes did not practice extensive amounts of selective breeding, but they sought out desirable horses through acquisition and quickly weeded out those with undesirable traits. By 1769, Plains Indians had horses all over the United States. El caballo blanco.
Del caballo blanco que un día domingo feliz arrancará, iba con la mira de llegar al norte, habiendo salido de Baguio, tierras nayaritas, entre cerros verdes y la luz del cielo. A paso más lento llego hasta Escuinapa y por Culiacán ya se andaba quedando. Cuentan que en los mochis ya se iba cayendo, que llevaba todo el hocico sangrando. Pero lo miraron pasar por Sonora y el Valle del Yaqui le dio su ternura. Dicen que cojeaba de la pata izquierda y a pesar de todo siguió su aventura. Y llegó hasta Hermosillo y siguió a Caborca y por Mexicali sintió que moría. Subió paso a paso por la Rumorosa, llegando a Tijuana a la luz del día. Cumplida su hazaña, se fue a Rosarito y no quiso echarse hasta ver Ensenada. Este es el corrido del caballo blanco que salió un domingo de Guadalajara.
Can you imagine the effort, not only of humans, but of the animals, to walk from Mexico City to New Mexico? Okay, so that's a beautiful image also of hunting. And the Apaches, that's how they learned to hunt, you know, watching the Spaniards using the horse. Read The Hands of Cantu. You can still buy some of the copies online. And, you know, this is a beautiful example of what a painter, writer, by observing his art, you can actually imagine the context of history. You know, the lesson of Tom Lee is that even though he is, you know, an illustrator, a painter, but he's also a historian. But it's not a historian of facts. It's a historian of context. And context is as important as the history itself. So that's another part of Tom Lee that I've learned this year. Thank you for inviting me and giving this presentation, and let's give a clap to everybody. Thank you very much.